tonight I'm going to talk about the Second World War in Britain, and I'm going to focus on a demographic that rarely gets the spotlight. We often, when we're thinking about World War II, we think about the military side. We think about, sometimes we might think about the Blitz, which has the civilian side involved, but we rarely think about middle-aged, married women, housewives, mothers, wives. We rarely talk about their experiences. So tonight, I want to focus our attention on these women. I want to focus on their experiences, and I want to focus on how they experienced the war, how they imagined themselves to be citizens during the war, how they imagined themselves participating in the war. And remembering that even as domestic soldiers in the home, they were out there doing work, volunteering, doing paid work sometimes, and even in the home, they were involved in fighting this war. And I want to talk about that tonight. And before I get started too, I just want to apologize. I have a tendency, when I lecture in class, I have a tendency to sort of roam around and use my hands and do all of that. I will try tonight not to do that because I understand that can be somewhat distracting and maybe my sound doesn't work as well. So I'll do my best to sort of pin myself to the ground tonight as I talk about this. And I also tend to move around when I get excited, and I do get quite excited about this topic. So anyway, as we start and we're thinking about Britain during World War II, it's important to remember that for the British, World War II was the People's War. This was a term that was coined very, very early on in October of 1939, and you'll still hear people talking about the People's War when you ask a Brit about World War II. It still comes through the newspapers, on the BBC. Whenever World War II is discussed, it is always as the People's War. And that's because the idea in total war was that everybody was important, not just the military, not just soldiers and sailors and pilots and all of the auxiliary individuals who were supporting military functions, but civilians were critical to this war, because civilians were not only on the front lines with the bombing that occurred, but also they were important in a number of different areas. So for instance, you had the possibility of invasion. And with that possibility of invasion, you had to mobilize men from all the way from 18 all the way into their 50s and 60s. Now, they don't say 18 here, but they were included as young men waited for their time when they were conscripted or before they could volunteer. They were involved in home defense in case of invasion. And so across the boards, whether you were young or whether you were middle-aged or edging into the sort of 60s, you had a role. And in fact, beyond, no matter what age you are, you had a role to play in this war. And the government made sure that you understood that through posters like what you just saw, and through posters like this, where we remind the civilians and the citizens that you are important because you need to be able to be self-sustaining. We can't import all of the food that we used to import because we need those ships for war material. We need those ships for troops. We need those ships to fight this war. We can't use that space anymore for luxury items, for clothing, for food, or what have you. So one of the things that the British government kept reminding its civilian citizens, they kept reminding you that you could help in many different ways. And one of them was through growing your own food. So that's whether you were a man, woman, or child, you could be involved in helping the war effort in that capacity. And here we also see another way in which children could be involved in recycling. So with their salvage efforts, you can see here that children would go around the neighborhood and they would go from door to door and they would ask residents for any kind of salvage that they might have available, metal and so forth, and they'd scrounge through the forests and in through the rivers and all of that, wherever they were playing, whatever they could find and dig up in the dirt, they would then offer that up to the recycling programs. And you can see here, this would be beneficial to the war effort. So you can see, regardless of whether you were young or old, whether you were a man or a woman, you could be involved in this war. So this is a total war. And of course, make do and mend, right? So again, we're not able to import clothing and so forth. So men, women, and children could make do and mend as well. So again, all of these things you could do and feel as though you were important to the war effort. So now focusing in more on women in particular, I think as Americans, I think as Americans, when we imagine women during this war, we can automatically conjure up an image of Rosie the Riveter. Here's an image that's a British image, the sort of parallel to Rosie the Riveter. And this is a poster, a well-known poster that was calling women to come into the factories. Now, by and large, when we talk about these women, they tend to be younger. They tend to be single. They tend to be what was called mobile, which means that the government could say to you, all right, so you're living somewhere in the Midlands. There's no factories in the Midlands, and where you live, we're going to move you to London, or we're going to move you to Birmingham or Manchester, or what have you. So you were mobile, and you tended to have no domestic obligations, right? You were single and you were young. And so the image of women during the war on the home front tends to really revolve around these individuals. But there were many other roles that women could take on. And this is where my focus is in tonight. Again, as I said, middle-aged, married women, housewives, wives, mothers. So mothers had a special role to play here, especially when it came to the potential of a war at home, potential of invasion, and the potential of bombing. Now, all the government and British civilians in 1938 understood that the next war would most certainly involve civilians. And they knew that, as one of their prime ministers said, Stanley Baldwin said, the bomber always gets through. They knew that because of the Spanish Civil War. They knew that because of the bombing of Guernica. And they understood that the bomber would and could and would get through. So what the British government decided to do was to create air raid precautions. So they would make air raid wardens. So all of that whole program started in 1938. They also created an evacuation scheme whereby young children, school-age children, would be evacuated into the countryside to places that the government thought would be safer than the cities. And here you see an image here, and I think this is really important. Don't do it, mother, right? So here's Hitler whispering into the mother's ear, and she's thinking about things, and she said, take them back, is what Hitler is saying. And what this is describing is, in the very beginning of the war, in the fall of 1939, there was an assumption that bombing would commence immediately when the war began. The British government was so sure of that, they ordered up 200,000 body bags in anticipation of the potential casualties that would happen if there was air raids. In those first couple of months, 200,000 casualties is what they imagined. Now, luckily for the British, the numbers never got that high. By the end of the war, it was about 68,000 civilians would perish as a result of bombing. But in the fall of 1939, that bombing did not happen. So children, and you've probably seen these iconic images of the young children with their teachers on the railway platforms, and they have little tags on them, and they've got their suitcases, and they're going off onto the railway car, and they're going out into the countryside. That happens in August and September 1939. No bombing occurs in the Western Front in the fall. All of the action happens in the East. All of it happens in Poland. What happens is what the British describe as the Boer War. So it's a play on the Boer War of the early 20th century. Americans call it the phony war. It just meant that nothing was happening. And because nothing felt like it was happening at home, there was a tendency to call those children back home, especially around Christmas time, right? Why are they there? Nothing's happening. Bring them home. We want them home for Christmas, right? But it was your job as a mother to protect your children by leaving them in the countryside where they were safe. Right. And again, it goes against all the impulses of being a parent to do this because we want to gather our children to us to protect us. But instead, the government is saying, no, no, no. The right thing to do here is to send them away and don't let them come back until the war is over. So we have a role here to play, a critical role. If we want to save our young people, as a mother, you've got a role to play. As domestic managers, we also have a role to play. That could be in the salvage efforts here. So you see the importance of bones during the war effort. And also as a domestic manager, as a cook. We want to be sure that the housewives and the mothers take care of the needs of their family, make sure that the meals are nutritious, and make sure that despite rationing, despite the fact that there isn't as much as what used to go around, despite the fact that we can't get the same food items that we had thought that we could before, maybe we can't afford them, but still we'll be able to make do, right? So make do and mend in the kitchen too also applies. And you see the images here, right? Better potluck with Churchill today than humble pie under Hitler tomorrow. This was about not wasting food, but also being a good domestic manager and coming up with tasty food too. The BBC had a program called The Kitchen Front, which started at 8:15 every morning. And on that program, you had various different announcers that were telling the housewives before they went out to shop what was available in the stores, and then giving them a recipe that went along with that as well. And many women tuned into those programs on a regular basis. So again, over and over and over again, whether you're looking at these images, these propaganda posters, whether you're reading the newspaper, whether you're talking to your neighbors, or whether you're listening to the BBC, you're getting loads of messages, really sort of telling you what you should and shouldn't do during the war. And in this past year, reflecting on COVID and all of the messages of this past year has really made me appreciate how this works, really, how much it must have created anxiety, how much it could have made you feel empowered. At least you know what you should be doing. I think about all the messages that CDC has given us over this past year, and you try to do the right thing for yourself, and you try to do the right thing for your children and your family and your coworkers and all of that. But there's all this sort of barrage of messages. And most certainly, that's what's happening during the war for the British, and even more so, I think, than what we've experienced in this last year. So I was interested, when I began my research, I was very interested to find out, how did this work? How did women negotiate these messages? Did they even pay attention to them? Did they even care what was being said? If they did listen to them, were they cynical about them? Did they take them on board? Did they listen? Did they find them helpful? So as a researcher, I wanted to find that out because I wanted to see where women who were primarily identified as housewives, women who were at home, for, and making a job of the home and of taking care of their children. I wanted to find out how they imagine themselves within the nation, and also as, their role during the war itself. And you can imagine how difficult that would be if you try to use Gallup polling, right? We are all familiar with Gallup poll, and it's either a yes or no question, or it can be a Likert scale of 1 through 5, and you kind of rate your scale. But you never can explain why it is that you choose that answer. So Gallup polling was never an answer for me because it's so incomplete. You can use diaries that have been published, and there are a number of those that are out there. But what I turned to was the work of mass observation. So mass observation was a social research organization that began in 1937. The founders were very concerned in 1937 about the abdication of Edward VIII and the way in which the media was portraying how ordinary people felt about that abdication. The founders of mass observation suspected that what the media and politicians were saying was not what ordinary British people really thought about the matter. To peel back that narrative that was driven by the media or by politicians and find out what people were really thinking. And I think about this again over this year, and wouldn't it be wonderful to know what it is that ordinary people really think, right? Instead of what all the media is saying, what social media is saying, all these messages that are going around. When you peel all of that off, what do you have? What do people think? So mass observation began in 1937 with that charge. And the way in which they do this is to ask you to write about a question. So they would pose a question such as, how do you feel about the abdication, right? And so what it is an open-ended question. You could write whatever you wanted to in response. You could write a paragraph. You could write 8 pages if you wanted to. You could discuss the abdication, or you could discuss something else, right? So you get to choose what you're going to respond, how you're going to respond to these questions. By the way, mass observation is still in operation. So they are right now sending out a questionnaire about the perception of and the feelings towards Prince Philip since he passed away recently. So this is a unique archive that allows us to get a sense of what ordinary people thought. So, and again, you can see this mass observations with Roundel, and you can see everything under the sun was part of this mission. We can talk about work, we can talk about sleep, eating, sex, learning, holidaying, queuing, whatever it is under the sun, they asked questions about and people wrote about. So for me, I was primarily interested in housewives, and I was primarily interested in middle age women. And so with that, I found 7 housewives. These are women who either identified as housewives or were identified as housewives. Now, that means that the archive or the mass observation staff at the time said, these women did not have a full-time career. They haven't told us what they would prefer to use. And so for all intents and purposes, they're housewives. Some of these women would never have chosen that. Nonetheless, because of their status at the time, they're labeled housewives. Now, the other thing that I needed to know was how the war might have changed these women. So for my women, my diarists, I looked at women who wrote both during the war and after the war. Some of these women started in 1937 writing for the organization. Others began writing in the early 1940s. Some of them wrote until about 1949, and some of them wrote all the way until 1968 for this organization. So we get a really good sense, a longitudinal sense of these women because they write pages upon pages over years and years. And that's the research that I did. Sometimes they're writing diaries about what they're doing on a day-to-day basis. And other times, every month, they're responding to questions such as, how is Churchill doing in the war? How do you feel about Americans? How is the war effort going for you? Everything under the sun. What's on your mantelpiece today? What are you dreaming about? Really anything under the sun. So it gave me a chance to really get to know these women. So a little bit more about these mass observers. I have some photographs here. Now, not all of the women sent in photographs. So sadly, I don't have the photographs of all 7, but these are the 4 women that did share their photographs with the Mass Observation Organization. And you can see the push pins on on England. And so you get a sense of where they come from. This sample largely derives from Midlands and north of England. As you can see up there, there's one individual who's down in Kent, which is the one, I don't know if my mouse can show it, but down here, just southeast of London. So this is my group of women. They are, at the beginning of the war, they're anywhere between 40 and 68. So again, we get a really nice group of individuals, of women that we don't ordinarily think about, sadly, especially because I'm a part of that demographic, and oftentimes I'm forgotten in the narrative of history. So these women, I really wanted to see what they said about the war. I wanted to learn about their experiences, and through those experiences, we can see a lot. And one of the things that I wanted to share with you was, again, going back to this theme, when we're thinking about women and the war, we do often think about women working in the factories. So I want to go back to that for 1 second and look at one individual of my sample who was involved in working. But before we get there, I just want to outline a couple of things that may be different between the British experience and the American experience. And that is that women in 1941 were required, and you can see the ages here, 18 to 60, women in that age group must register for work. So they had to let the government know that they were available, where they were, and what the hours that they were available to work were. By the end of that year, women are conscripted for work, for war work. And of course, you know this is necessary because what we have is men, by and large, being either conscripted or volunteering into military positions. That's not the case for all men, obviously. Many men do stay. Those who are in reserved occupations, those are occupations that the government deems important and essential during the war. This could be bankers. This could be coal miners. So a number of men were reserved and could not volunteer to fight the war. They had to stay home. But for women, at the end of 1941, women in that age group, in the younger age group, are conscripted, and then it's sort of over time, it builds out to the 40s. Women in their 40s get conscripted. Now, there are exceptions to this. Women with, or mothers with children under 14, they're exempted. Pregnant women are exempted. And women who have heavy domestic obligations are also exempted. So this would be maybe a young woman who has elderly parents to take care of. Her obligations are such that she can't really be mobile, but maybe she can work at a local office or factory. Or if you had a number of children to look after, and you could ask for exemptions as well under this. But what we find is that a number of women actually appreciate this and look towards or look forward to getting a job for the war effort, because they believe that's the only way that they can really participate in a meaningful way. So that's for a number of women. And we see by 1944, 7 million women have entered the workforce over the time of this war. For many, though, they volunteered. So they understood that they couldn't be, given their domestic obligations or other obligations, they couldn't necessarily be tied down to a full-time job or even a part-time job, but they could volunteer. And that was how they participated in this war effort. So one of my diarists, Edie Rutherford, was born in South Africa. She was born in 1902. And she married a man from Sheffield, which is in the north of England. And she moved to Sheffield before the war in the 1920s. So she's married, but she does not have any children. And for the first part of her diary, she begins writing in 1941. She writes on a regular basis about her journey of finding a job, looking for jobs that would suit her. She did not want to work in a factory, so she looked for office work. And so she had this very long and very frustrating journey to find the job she really wanted. And it gives you a sense of, even though women are conscripted, there is some agency, there is some negotiation that women were involved or could be involved in. And so she would go on interviews, she would find a job, or she would be told about a job, she'd go on interviews, she'd find out how much they paid, and she might turn it down. And this goes on for an entire year. Eventually, she does find the job that she wants, and she finds an office job, which she holds for about 2 years during the course of the war. She's a fascinating writer, and I'll share some of her words in just a moment with you. But one of the things that I really appreciated about reading her diaries was every day she went through the news. And it was like I was opening a newspaper, and she would tell you everything that was happening on that day, whether it was in the war, whether it was at home, whether it was in South Africa or the empire, because as a South African, as a proud South African, she was very proud of the empire, and she wrote a lot about this. So as a researcher, this was wonderful for me, because when you read diaries, and maybe you can imagine this, maybe you write a diary yourself and you've gone back and you've looked over these diaries, there's a lot that's taken for granted, a lot of kind of wink, wink, nod, nod, kind of Monty Python, know what I mean, right? There's a lot of that goes on in these diaries, because they knew that mass observation was reading them, and they knew that mass observation knew what they were talking about, because they were living that. Well, here I am, some 70 years later, and I don't know all of those things. So Edie was wonderful, because she taught me all of those things. She taught me where to look and where to go beyond the overarching sort of chronology that we get in all of the books. She was helping me find out all of the other aspects of local news or national news that never made the history books. Women and other civil servants who are embezzling money, for instance. You hear it in her diary. And so it was really wonderful. It was like sitting down and having a cup of coffee with her every morning and finding out about the news, and then also finding about her news as well. You'll find that I got a little close to these women, so I hope you don't find that strange. But when you read these women's diaries and you read so much about them, you get to know them, you know their personality, you get to expect how they write, what they write. And in fact, when they stop writing, you know something's going on. Women who write pages upon pages and then stop for a little bit tells you something. And indeed, for one of the women that that I'm not going to talk about too much tonight, she wrote every single day, and then all of a sudden, for 2 months, she doesn't write. And when she picks back up, she talks about having an affair. So she didn't write for mass observation. And she tells mass observation, I couldn't write about this at the time, but this is what was going on. And it's those silences that sometimes clue us in. But you really get to know these women. And for Edie, I really enjoyed that aspect of just sort of keeping in touch with the news, and then telling us about herself. So here's one of her, and I have to move my Zoom screen here for just a second here so I can read it to you. So this is one of her diary entries that describes going to an interview. And it talks a little bit about some of the frustrations that she found in doing this. So, Labor Exchange sent for me. Would I go to income tax offices in suburbs about a job to replace a younger woman? I went. Interviewed by a rather nice man in the 30s and a very old man about 70 who was both ignorant and silly. I did not go down well because 1, I am 40, 2, I have not worked for 10 years, 3, I have not worked in Sheffield, 4, I had no Sheffield references. The condescension was pitiful. One would think I was dying to work for them, which I am not. By the time I came away, several more women were waiting to be interviewed, all junior to me. So I know that's another job I don't get. And this is a theme for her. On a regular basis, what she finds is that she keeps getting passed over for jobs that she wants by younger women. And again, for women who've left the workforce, we're seeing that as well. Sort of, it's hard to get back into the workforce when you've left it for a couple of years. And so we do get that sense. And again, this goes on for about a year, and she finally is able to find that work. Now, something else that I see quite a lot in the diaries are the experiences of living through the Blitz, living through bombing. And so many of my diarists, indeed all but one, talk about their town or their suburb being bombed by the Germans. So this is an image of Coventry, which is in the Midlands. Coventry suffered a massive bombing in the fall of 1940. And one of my diarists lived right outside Coventry. By the way, to coventrate was coined at this time. It entered the lexicon, and what it meant was to raise a city to the ground by bombing. So that tells you about this shock that the British experienced with the bombing of Coventry. Now, Audrey Hatley lived in actually she lived on the outskirts of Coventry. She'd lived there her entire life. And Audrey's diaries rarely talked about the war, if ever. Her son was a soldier. She never talked about him. All she ever talked about was the theater work that she did. She did volunteer theater for her church and for the young people in her community. And that's what her diaries are about. Rarely, if ever, does the war ever intrude in her diaries, with the exception of this one day. And she talks about going into the city center and not being able to find Boots. Now, for those of you who've traveled to England, you may know Boots. Boots is a pharmacy. Back in the day, it was also a lending library. So you would go to Boots to get your library books. And then it was also a pharmacy. And so here, the city center that she knew so well, absolutely gone. For another woman, Alice Bridges, she lived in Birmingham. And a couple of days after Coventry was bombed, Birmingham was also bombed, nearly devastated. For her, Alice lived in the suburbs, and she talks about running out to her Anderson shelter, which is a shelter that's dug into the garden, and that you dig in, and then you have a corrugated steel top that the government gave you. Then you put the sod from your lawn over the top of it. And then you can go down inside and you have benches and places to sleep. Anybody who's seen Mrs. Miniver from the war from 1942, there's a really nice shots of being inside an Anderson shelter. So Alice talks about hearing the air raid sirens go. And when she hears those, everybody all has to run out to the garden, down into the Anderson shelter. And she talks about making the tea, putting all of the tea in the crockery onto her tray, and running out to the garden. Meanwhile, above her, the tracers from the machine guns are going as the Germans are strafing people. The bombs are dropping all around her home. Later, after I read this account, I went and I looked at the bomb survey, and it turns out at least 10 high explosive bombs dropped right near her house. When you looked at the suburbs, they would look like this. And I was astonished to even that she really escaped, by and large, her house escaped the kind of damage that we see here. She talks about the fear that she felt sitting in the Anderson shelter. She said her feet went cold as ice blocks, sitting there. She's got her tea, but she's still scared to death. And one of the other things that you had to do, right, with the, it's now, a sort of this iconic thing, the British upper lip, stiff upper lip. But this was part of the People's War. You were not to show fear. You were not to break down in front of other people. You had to hold that in. And in fact, there are programs on the BBC and dramas and so forth that demonstrate the proper way of dealing with this was to go into a darkened area and cry if you need to, but never cry in front of anybody else. Don't let anybody see that it's got you down. So that's part of being a soldier on this war front. So I just want to wrap up now with thinking about all of these experiences that women had during the war. And, I think it's safe to say that every single woman that I looked at, and there's 7 of them, were unique, had unique experiences, and dealt with the war and the pressures of the war in vastly different ways. And so we see this Keep Calm and Carry On, which, by the way, is a wonderful marketing campaign that works really well now. And you can slap all sorts of things on there like Keep Calm and Cook On or whatever. This never made it into the British on the British streets. This was not a campaign that had any legs. Instead, the one campaign that did have some legs, which looks very similar to this, is this: your courage, your cheerfulness, your resolution will bring us victory. Now, if you go back and you read the history books, many people are critical of this particular poster because it's you, us. So where's the we, right? And everybody says, oh, well, this was alienating. For one of my women, Nella Last, who I'll tell you about in just a moment, Nella Last looked at that poster during the first week of the war and said, right, I know what I need to do. I can do this. I have courage. I can be cheerful. I can do this. So for her, this message hit home something for her, and she took it home, or she really took it to heart. Other people, not so much. So there's a double-edged sword to all of this messaging that goes on, because on the one hand, you could find your place in all of these different messages. And the tagline here is, if only they tell us all what to do, right? And you see all of the various different propaganda messages: when you're supposed to shop, salvage your items, don't travel if you don't need to, all of this other kind of, all the messages that are going on. And so for some people, like Nella Last, you could see yourself there. You could say, aha, I know what I can do. And through that, I'll fight this war. Now, for others, it's much more like a guilt trip, right? All of these things. I need to do all of these things. I should be doing this. If I'm not doing this, I'm not doing enough. And so it really could become overwhelming for some women. And this is the case, as I finish up here tonight, Nella Last and one of my other diarists, Helen Mitchell. For Nella, as we just learned, Nella found a place for herself as a volunteer. She was a wonderful cook. She lived in a household with 2 sons and a husband who never paid attention to her, a husband who never thanked her for doing the hard work that she ever did in the 1920s and 1930s, raising her children, cooking wonderful food, never a word of recognition ever from her husband. During the war, all of those messages and her volunteering, people said, Nella, how did you cook that wonderful meal? Tell us all about how you did this. And she felt empowered by that. And she made friends where she volunteered, and she talked to young women who had just had children, and she gave them advice, and she just felt so empowered by this. So here's just a snippet of her diary. And it gives you a sense of how she could interpret the People's War in a very empowering and positive way. And she wrote, I like to be busy, and I like the company too at Center. This is the Women's Voluntary Center. I like to be with people when I'm working. This week has made me realize even more what a blessing to me my work is and what a lot I owe to it. I'm not as patient as I used to be. And when I look at my husband so content to just sit night after night, rarely speaking, never talking or discussing things, and realize he's only 53 and not 83, I thank God so often for the opportunity of working at Center. Such a privilege. I must not grumble, though, for I've broken loose and am free now after a struggle. So you really get a sense here of how how empowering it was. And also she starts to sort of talk back to her husband as well. And when he says, well, you need to stay home and make my dinner, she goes, well, no, I don't, because I have to volunteer and I'm a soldier on the People's Front. And she goes off and she makes a world for herself. And she feels recognized, right? So much of what it is that we want is to be recognized. Writing her diary for mass observation got her recognized, and we still talk about her. She's got books. You can find books on Nella Last now anywhere. If you go, especially if you go on amazon.co.uk, she's a minor celebrity now because of her diary. And she was really empowered by this war. But I'll finish with Helen Mitchell. Helen Mitchell, I don't have a picture of her, but I imagine her as this woman here, cover art for E.M. Delafield's Diary of a Provincial Lady. If you've not read this, it is a scream and a hoot. It is funny to read. It is a diary. And it's really about servants, and it's about sort of this life of leisure and so forth. And that's what Helen Mitchell had until the war. So for Helen, she was absolutely overwhelmed by this war. She couldn't do what she wanted to do. She had all of these messages being barraged at her. She didn't want to volunteer. All she really wanted to do was to do volunteer theater. But her husband moved her from Aberdeen in Scotland to Kent, down in the southeast of England. She had no friends. She wasn't connected. Nothing stuck for her. Everything overwhelmed her. And when she writes in the diary, you really get that sense of tragedy here. And what we see with her writing, usually it's very terse. By the way, Nella Last's diaries, at least 8 pages a day. Helen Mitchell's usually about this length, so about 3 or 4 sentences every day. And this is the tone of it. Went to London to have lunch with RT, that's her husband. In filthy temper I was. There's something the matter with all of us, wanting to do more or wanting something to work for. Felt I'd had no right to travel or to take someone's place in the restaurant. In fact, unless I can be useful, no right to exist. So for her, all of those messages, and you see this in her diary, it became overwhelming. What can I do? What should I do? If I'm not doing something, I am useless. She's constantly fighting with her husband. She's constantly nagged by housework. She calls her husband and her son the stomachs. So she refers to them as the stomachs. And she said, oh, they're coming home today. The stomachs want food. I'm going to have to make the food. She fights with them through the entire war and can never really find her place. And so I think as we think about these experiences, as we even sort of reflect on our own experience in this past year of the pandemic, it's so uneven. We all have our unique experiences. We all hear similar messaging, but the way that we negotiate it, the supports that we have or the supports we don't have, really changes our lenses on the world, changes our responses, and each of us have our own stories. Each of us make up this wonderful, wonderful fabric of humanity, and each of us contribute in our own way. And that was something that I learned in reading about these women's lives. And I'm happy to share more with you at this time. I know I've run over and I apologize for that. Happy to answer any questions and hear what you're thinking about. And I can talk more about any of my other women too. So thank you very much.
I'm going to share something that is in chat from a participant. It says, thank you for this. I am British, and my mom and her family survived the Blitz in London. I grew up hearing stories of the bombings, rationing, sheltering in the underground, allotment gardens, and you can be certain I have channeled her, my granny, and all my aunties during the last year or so.
Absolutely. Over and over and over again, I've been channeling them too. And I think to myself, my gosh, I'm complaining about a year. And these women went through 5 years. They never knew how long the war was going to last. It was hard. It was hard to live, through that time period. And yet there's so much that you see that come through those experiences. And I'm sure that you got it too, all the stories that you've heard about the war. You can hear the heroism that I think was part of it, but also the real difficulty that some people had just living through these time periods. And I think as never before, frankly, when I did this work in the early 2000s, I was younger, I didn't have any children. And I don't think I got it as much as I get it now. So yeah, definitely channeling them this year.
Yeah. We have a question here. Are there any other books you might suggest?
There's thousands of books that I would suggest. There's a thriving market right now. And I'm sorry, I'm a British historian, so I tend to sort of go on amazon.co.uk. But the publishers in the UK have really, in the last 10 to 15 years, have offered up many stories of women just like these women, younger women too. There's wonderful stories about specific years. I think there's a blanking on the woman's last name, but she's written a story or written a history of 1945, and it's just an amazing account. I would also, there's some old books that are great. Angus Calder's People's War was written in 1968, but it's still the standard. He used mass observation. He was one of the first people to use mass observation. So he really gets a good sense of the social history of the time. But there's wonderful general histories and wonderful also sort of pinpointed micro histories. And it would be hard for me to pick out any other ones other than Angus Calder's, because he just, I don't think anybody's improved on that history. I'll have to think though, as you all ask me questions, I'll think some more about it, and I might be able to come back to you for some more at the end.
Well, we do have more comments, and while I'm searching for them, I'll comment that I think that some of these women were like the beginning bloggers, and why you could take part of their work and turn it into a diary, right? I mean, they're with one of your women writing 8 pages a day. That adds up to a book.
Absolutely. And I will say to that too, these aren't diaries like the diaries we keep. They knew they had an audience. So they knew mass observation, the staff would read them. They knew that the staff wrote reports that they sent to the government and that they wrote articles on. So some of these women actually thought that their writing was war work as well. They were volunteering for the war effort by writing for that.
Wow, that's great. Another comment here from Reg. In the USA, when the war ended, the women who had worked in factories and other places where they had not been before were told to go home, get back in the kitchen, and stop taking jobs from men who were returning from war. Was this true for the British women as well?
Yeah, in general, this is true. The one significant difference is that because Britain had so much more reconstruction to do, they had more jobs than we did. And so if you wanted to stay on, you could, but it turned out that a lot of women just wanted to go back home too. So there is that message of go home, but there was also women who chose to return. And there were women who were kicked out of their jobs. But I would say the experience was generally the same, but perhaps less to a lesser degree.
We got 2 more questions. One is, can you simply repeat the UK Amazon?
So it's amazon.co.uk. So co.uk.
Okay, Amazon.co. UK. Okay. And where can you, oh, sorry, go ahead.
I was also going to say you can get my book, Domestic Soldiers, if you want to. You can get it in the UK. You can get it used on Amazon.com. And I think there's some Kindle versions that are available as well.
Oh, that's great. And you would find some of these housewives in that.
You
book.
find all of them.
All of them, right. Where do you access mass observation?
Yeah. So right now, mass observation is in an archive at the University of Sussex, which is on the south coast of England. It's where I went and got my doctorate at the University of Sussex. You could go to the archive there. That's a little bit more tricky to get to. And so a lot of their material has been digitized by an organization called Adam Matthew. These are available in large universities and colleges. So access is difficult. If you don't have access to a university library or to St. Mike's Library, because we actually happen to have the database because of my work, it's difficult to get a hold of. So earlier when you introduced me, Cal, you said, you mentioned me being the editor of Mass Observation Critical Series. So this series is just beginning, and it's taken some time because of the pandemic to really get going. But it's my intention to publish through this series much more that you can purchase in a book form. And I'm working with Bloomsbury, who's a publishing house out of Britain, but they also have American folks here as well, an American arm. And they're committed to publishing both here in America and in the UK. And I want to get as much as I possibly can get out there for people to read. My book on the royalty will feature some essays by me, but most of it will be writing, like I shared with you today, because I feel like they have more to tell you than I do.
And another question, what do studies tell us about the impact on the lives of the children who were sent away and separated from their families?
Yeah. This is very uneven. Like the question about what happens with women after the war and whether they stay in their jobs or return home. For the evacuation experience, it's very uneven. It depends on their home life before the war and what they experienced when they were evacuated. So what we'll see is some children had a horrific experience. They tended to be, the evacuation process wasn't that great. People would they would volunteer and they would sort of say, I can take 3 kids. And then they would go to a reception center and they'd say, I want that one, and that one. And, if you had 4 brothers and they only wanted 3 and they're the last people, you might have 3 brothers go one place and 1 brother go another place. And so that's incredibly traumatic. On the other hand, it worked out in some instances where children really bonded with their evacuation families. In some children, so I'm giving you the worst and the best here, and then there's a continuum through this. But some of these children never went home. They were adopted by their evacuated families. So it really, it can run the gamut. And again, incredibly uneven. Some traumatic, and there was a lot of class bias. These sort of ragged children from the slums of London have come out to the countryside, and they don't know how to clean themselves, and they wet the beds all the time. There's no understanding about how this trauma is impacting children, and that might contribute to some of their behavior and some of their bedwetting and so forth. There's very little of that. So that could be traumatic as well. There are a number of works that have been written about those children's experiences. And again, like I said before, you're getting individual stories that you can find that are in the press, but also you can find larger stories. For those of you, by the way, the one that sticks in my mind is actually an American text. This is more about children, but Daddy's Gone to War is a wonderful book about children during World War II who their fathers went off to fight the war. And that gives you that question of like, how did children experience the war and how did it impact them moving forward? It's written by a psychologist, and it gives you a good sense of it. It's American, it's not British, but it does give you a good sense of those types of questions.
Well, we are over by 1 minute, but one more question maybe. I'm wondering if there was kind of a good cross section of people from different socioeconomic backgrounds, ethnicities, pockets of England that participated in or were even sought out for the mass observation project, or if it kind of skews one way.
Yeah. This is one of the major problems with mass observation. So again, these are self-selecting individuals. They decide to volunteer. During the war in the 1940s, they tend to be English. So as you saw, all of my women are English. There are a couple in Wales, a couple in Ireland, a couple in Scotland, but they tend to be English. They tend to be middle class. They tend maybe upper working class, and they tend to lean left politically. But Nella is a hard and fast conservative. There's lots of conservatives who are also in this sample. The sample today tends to be Southeast England, tends to be white, both the early project and today tends to be white, and again, tends to be sort of middling age now. There are efforts right now to try and get younger men. They've for years tried to get younger men to write for them. They're trying to get people of color to also write for them as well. And frankly, when I think about the work that they're doing now, they still ask for people to write on paper. And there's been a lot of sort of conversation about, okay, like, can we get this digitized? Can people write it up and send it in an email? Because if we can get the younger demographic. So you said the blogging, young people are already sort of, connected in that kind of way. So instead of blogging or tweeting 144 characters or something else, give them a digital format that they understand. Mm-hmm. And we'll get more, but there's a drive now, and that is one of the big problems for mass observation. Absolutely wonderful questions.
Well, I think with that, we probably should say goodnight for the evening, and thank you. What a wonderful presentation, so energizing. It just makes you hungry for more. I'm writing notes about books maybe we should get at the library. Thank you, Jen. We should all go to the UK Amazon, look for her book.